These were individuals who built literal empires, right? They possessed wealth that rivaled small nations, armies of loyal enforcers, and a level of power that made them seem completely untouchable by the law or society. But the reality of how these crime bosses and outlaw legends actually met their ends? It's a stark, honestly gruesome contrast to the legendary power they wielded in life. Okay, let's dive into this and explore the fascinating, sometimes deeply unsettling final moments of history's most infamous outlaws.
Here is our agenda for today. We'll be covering the public spectacles, betrayed by their own, bizarre and ironic ends, Hollywood myths versus reality, and finally, the final verdict. Now, we aren't just going to rattle off dates and names chronologically here. Instead, we're really exploring the psychological and thematic connections behind how the underworld's most untouchable figures finally fell. Section 1. The public spectacles, or the brazen endings of outlaw legends. Because for some of these outlaws, their deaths were just as loud, chaotic, and glaringly public as their lives, perfectly matching the explosive nature of their crimes. 1067. Now, this isn't a timeline, and it's definitely not a bank robbery haul. This is the exact number of times Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow's stolen Ford V8 was struck by bullets in rural Louisiana on May 23, 1934. A posse of 6 lawmen had finally tracked down the notorious couple who had spent 2 whole years robbing their way across the Midwest. The barrage of gunfire was just so absolute that the coroner later noted the bodies were so riddled with holes they literally couldn't even hold embalming fluid. Let's break down the timeline of that morning. 9:15 a.m., the tan Ford approaches the ambush site. Seconds 1 through 15, just deafening, simultaneous fire from Browning automatic rifles, shotguns, and pistols. Second 16, the gunfire ceases, and the car rolls to a stop. 16 seconds. That is all it took. There were no shouted warnings, no orders to stop or surrender. They simply opened fire and didn't stop until their magazines were completely empty. It's a brutal, rapid-fire reality that completely shatters that whole romanticized outlaw myth. Bonnie and Clyde never even had a chance to draw their weapons.
And you know, this brazenly public style of ending wasn't just some 1930s phenomenon. Contrast Bonnie and Clyde with 2 other spectacular public deaths. First, take Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino crime family. In 1985, he was executed right on a Manhattan sidewalk outside Sparks Steakhouse at 5 p.m. during the Christmas rush hour. That was a hit orchestrated by John Gotti, specifically to demonstrate his absolute boldness. Now contrast that with the infamous Medellin cartel boss Pablo Escobar in 1993. Cornered by Colombian police, Escobar makes this desperate, barefoot run across terracotta rooftops before being shot down. And it ended with grinning officers posing with his corpse for a trophy picture that went global within hours. Totally different eras, for sure, but equally spectacular public falls.
Moving on to Section 2, betrayed by their own, and the sheer cost of proximity. Because the outlaws we are about to look at weren't killed by a posse of lawmen or a highly public rival hit squad. They were eliminated by the associates they let right into their innermost circles. This brings us to a really fascinating detail. What did the unburned sausages reveal? Well, in June 1975, Sam Giancana, the former Chicago mob boss, was cooking sausages and peppers in his basement kitchen when he was shot in the back of the head. When police arrived, they found Giancana dead, but the sausages were still on the stove, and they weren't burned. That highly specific detail told investigators pretty much everything they needed to know. It meant the attack happened quickly, but more importantly, it meant Giancana completely trusted his killer. He let them into his home, and he felt comfortable enough to literally turn his back to them so he could cook. Then you have the incredibly swift, ruthless business of betrayal. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was just relaxing on a sofa in a quiet Beverly Hills mansion in 1947, reading the LA Times. Out of nowhere, a gunman fires a military-grade M1 carbine through the window. The forensic reality here is incredibly gruesome. One bullet hit the bridge of his nose with such force it blew his eye completely out of its socket, landing like 15 feet across the room. But the most chilling detail? Within minutes of that trigger being pulled, East Coast mobsters casually walked into his Las Vegas casino, the Flamingo, and just took it over. As his body lay bleeding in California, his former partners were already managing his empire. It was just a brutal change of management.
Section 3. Bizarre and ironic ends, because you simply can't shoot mortality. Now, what's really interesting about this section is how some of the most fearsome bosses met profoundly humiliating, surreal, or helpless ends.
Take the ultimate kingpin, Al Capone.
Here's a man who ruled Chicago's bootlegging empire during Prohibition with absolute power and absolutely ruthless violence. But his reality? Capone didn't die in a daring escape or a hail of bullets. He died in 1947 in his bed down in Florida. Years of untreated neurosyphilis had slowly destroyed his brain, reducing this legendary criminal emperor to a confused state with the mental capacity of a 12-year-old child.
And then we have the haunting end of New York bootlegger Dutch Schultz. Shot in a restaurant restroom in 1935, Schultz did not die instantly. Instead, he lingered in a hospital bed with a raging 106-degree fever for 22 straight hours. Police actually stationed a stenographer right by his bed, hoping he'd name his killers. But instead of some dramatic dying declaration of revenge, Schultz drifted into this surreal fever dream, muttering bizarre poetry and phrases like French-Canadian bean soup, I want to pay, let him leave me alone. He took the names of his killers to the grave, leaving behind only pages of these fevered, completely disjointed ramblings.
But perhaps the most surreal of all is the death of Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner and boss of a New York crime family. In 1957, he's sitting in a barber's chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel with hot towels draped right over his eyes. When two hitmen enter and open fire, the blinded mob boss completely panics. Able to see only the reflection in the massive mirror in front of him, Anastasia violently lunges forward, attacking the reflections in the glass while the real hitmen shoot him from behind. This completely surreal image of a boss fighting his own reflection marked the end of an era of overtly violent gangster leadership.
Section 4, Hollywood Myths versus Reality, and the Unglamorous Truth. And this brilliantly illustrates how the cinematic versions we've all seen compare to the actual forensic evidence, which is far less glamorous.
Let's look at Tony Spilotro, the notorious Las Vegas enforcer whose life inspired Joe Pesci's character in the movie Casino. Now, the Hollywood myth shows him and his brother being beaten to death with baseball bats in an Indiana cornfield. But the grim reality? Spilotro actually thought he was driving to a house to receive a promotion. Instead, it was an ambush. He was beaten severely with fists and feet, no baseball bats, but the most horrifying forensic detail came when his body was found 5 days later in a shallow grave. The autopsy revealed sand in his lungs. Tony Spilotro hadn't been killed by the beating. He had been driven to that cornfield unconscious and buried alive. He suffocated underground.
That same unglamorous truth caught up with James Whitey Bulger. For decades, he operated as a Boston crime boss with complete impunity, fully protected by corrupt agents because he was an FBI informant. But in 2018, at 89 years old, frail and sitting in a wheelchair, his untouchable status completely evaporated. Less than 12 hours after being transferred to a West Virginia penitentiary, inmates attacked him. They beat the elderly boss to death using a padlock stuffed in a sock and even attempted to gouge out his eyes and cut out his tongue, which are the traditional degrading mob punishments for an informant.
Which brings us to Section 5, the final verdict. Live by the sword. So, the crucial point is this. Regardless of how these individuals carried themselves, whether as overtly violent enforcers or diplomatic businessmen, the underworld administered the exact same abrupt, unceremonious justice.
Just consider the sheer suddenness of it all. Carmine Galante, aggressively trying to consolidate the drug trade, is gunned down on a private restaurant patio in 1979, dying instantly with his trademark cigar still clenched tight in his teeth. Then you have Angelo Bruno in 1980. He was known as the Gentle Don for preferring negotiation over violence. Well, it didn't matter. He was sitting in the passenger seat of his parked car outside his home when a shotgun blast to the back of the head ended his life and kicked off a massive mob war. And Joe Gallo, celebrating his birthday at 4:30 a.m. in 1972, ambushed in front of his family, stumbling out to die on the Manhattan sidewalk. Boom, boom, boom. The Gentle Don or the ruthless enforcer, the end is exactly the same.
So, we've looked at the evidence together. The 16-second fusillades, the unburned sausages, the sand in the lungs. And we're really left with a fundamental realization about the whole outlaw myth. These figures built massive empires on fear and violence. They dictated the lives and deaths of thousands. But when you look at how abruptly, how ironically, and how helplessly their own ends arrived, it leaves us with one highly provocative question. Did any of them truly have control? It's a fascinating lens through which to view history, and it definitely makes you rethink the legends.